Hello. And as per usual, this is not working right. Just a sec. Okay, I gotta fix that. That'll just be a sec. Will that fix it? Let's find out. Let's find out. No, it won't. Hold on. Just a moment. Just a moment with you. I'm gonna look at the slideshow. And this is in the wrong order. Okay. Alright, okay. Alright, okay. I think that's good. I think we're okay. Alright, how's the audio? Is the audio okay? Please let me know. Awesome. Okay, folks, I'm just going to get right into this. By the way, the stream is being moderated. Please don't be, just don't. So yeah, this talk is going to be about 45 minutes. I'm going to have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of it. There will be a VOD of it, and I will upload it to YouTube. Probably not immediately, but I will within the next week. And I will edit out the beginning because I know everyone was mad because the last talk I didn't edit it at all because I'm very lazy. But all right, let's go. What is this talk? So I'm going to be talking about how armor works mechanically and how it doesn't work in games. Also, just so you know, I might occasionally glance at the stream, but otherwise I'm not going to be looking, so save your questions until the end. I'm mostly talking about role-playing games. Obviously, there are games that have armor that aren't role-playing games. There are plenty of action games that have armor. Plenty of games have armor, but this is specifically about RPGs and games that have vertical progression in armor. By vertical progression, generally I mean number gets bigger. There are statistics, they get better over time, the armor increases in effectiveness, however you measure that, that's vertical progression. These are my observations on strengths and pitfalls from different systems that I've worked with or that I've seen used in games. This is not a conclusive talk, this is a speculative talk, this is my opinions on how these systems work and don't work. This talk overall is more sort of intro and mid-level than advanced design knowledge. So if you are not a game developer, or if you are a designer who just started out, this is probably more interesting to you than if you are someone who's been working on this stuff for 10, 15, 20 years. There aren't a lot of us around, but in case that's the case, that's what's going on. So this is more opinion and feelsy than hard and fast. I have strong biases on these things. And yes, there will be a video on demand. I will upload it to YouTube. There will be a Q&A session at the end. By the way, if you went to the Italian D-Stars session, I actually did give more or less this talk once before. I did edit it a little bit, but if you're the hardcore D-Stars fan and you're coming here, sorry that I didn't radically change this talk. But there you go. So, who am I? If you don't know, my name is Josh Sawyer. I don't know how you got here if you don't know who I am. I'm the studio design director at Obsidian. Starting in 1999, I worked at Black Isle Studios. I worked on Icewind Dale and Icewind Dale Heart of Winter and Icewind Dale 2 and some canceled projects, which I listed right there. Since 2005, I've been at Obsidian, where I worked on Neverwinter Nights 2. I directed Fallout New Vegas and Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, and I am directing an unannounced project right now. I focus primarily on system design and narrative design. Today, I'm just talking about system design because, well, there are narrative things that can go into how armor is designed, but I'm just focusing on the systemic issues for today. What are the goals of armor systems? Obviously, that depends on game to game, but I think there are some general goals that you can find in 99% of games that use armor with vertical progression. They mitigate damage. I know that's like, holy crap. Yeah, they reduce damage by a number of means, and we'll find that there are actually a lot of different ways to do this. They create a range of statistical trade-offs. So armor has different statistics. You might want to wear one suit of armor over another. When the player looks at them, they have to do a little bit of mental math to figure out like, oh, okay, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. They allow room for vertical progression. Armor can get better. It starts off okay or bad, it gets good, and then it gets incredible. It allows for a range of varied aesthetic styles, and I will touch on that because that's not irrelevant. In fact, it's extremely relevant. It's not really the focus of this talk, so I don't want to dwell on it too much, but many people wear armor because it looks cool and because it fulfills a fantasy within that setting. So, allowing for a range of varied aesthetic styles. This is all armor from Elden Ring, and Elden Ring, I think From Software, I think hopefully a lot of people would agree that they have really great aesthetics to their armor design. It straddles this very nice line between being historically inspired but also fantastic. Really cool stuff. There's dozens of suits of armor and outfits in the game, and these aesthetics both sort of reinforce a lot of the lore about the world, and they also fulfill the fantasies, especially if you wear it, of the sort of character that you're trying to embody. Those aesthetic styles are important, especially in a third-person game where you can see your character a lot. These are armors from Fallout 3 and New Vegas, and again, these encompass certain aesthetic styles, certain character concepts, factions within the world. These are all very important. And then we have Cyberpunk 2077, where you have corpos and punks and military and all that spectrum of aesthetics that the player might want to embody based on their character type and their concept within the world. And they want to fit into the world, but they want to stand out within the world. And those are all very important things. So the challenge for us designers in my opinion, the main challenge is how can we make an armor system where different types and aesthetics of armor are valuable in the game in distinct ways that also scale well throughout the game. You think this is easy, but we usually kind of mess it up in more than one way while we're making stuff. So again, let's go back to these goals, and I'm going to talk about things that we're going to talk about and then something we're not going to talk about. Mitigate damage, create a range of statistical trade-offs, allow room for vertical progression, and allow for a range of varied aesthetic styles. We're not really going to talk about the aesthetic styles because that's not systemic. It is important. I did want to address it because it's important. But we're going to talk about mitigating damage, those statistical trade-offs, and vertical progression. So let's start from my earliest memory, and arguably like sort of the foundation of both tabletop and CRPG ways of representing armor, which is Dungeons and Dragons. I started playing basic Dungeons and Dragons and first edition advanced D&D. The way in which armor works in D&D now is pretty much the same as it was back then, more or less. If you have, within reason. So heavier armor generally is a better armor class, which means you're harder to hit. And so it's mitigation through avoidance. You don't absorb damage, you just don't get hit. In the earlier editions, heavier armor was more or less just better. Fighters could wear armor, magic users could not. Fighters usually had a better armor class, although depending on the edition, that got really nuts. So I did want to talk a little bit about mitigation and avoidance, which is kind of a false dichotomy that comes up in a number of armor systems. So there's a shift from the idea of armor is harder to hit to heavier armor is easier to hit but harder to damage. So there's a distinction there. I'm wearing armor, my armor class goes up, you don't hit me, versus no, I'm wearing armor, it's not harder to hit me. In fact, maybe it's easier to hit me, but I absorb damage. And those two things being separate statistics that the player is sort of advancing and progressing. Games like WoW more or less do this, although it's not quite that simple. There are a number of systems that do this, where I can be the agile rogue or I can be the tank, But in both ways, you're essentially a tank. You're a dodge tank or you are an absorptive tank. So this is damage reduction versus dodge. It's an all or nothing sort of system. If you don't get hit wearing no armor, you take no damage. If you absorb the damage, then you're probably getting hit more regularly, but you're sucking that damage up. Wild style dodge versus armor. Souls and Elden Ring, heavy tank fat roll versus mobility. Again, these are not actually usually good dichotomies for reasons I'll go into. It usually, not always, winds up feeling non-compelling as a general dichotomy because it's not distinct in most cases. It's just two different ways of not taking damage. They may play differently if the system is one where it's an action-oriented game. Something like Elden Ring may in fact play differently. If it's something where you're kind of remote controlling the character, something more like WoW, your actions to do that don't necessarily feel that much different. You're buffing different stats, but it will wind up being a wash. Either both methods are more or less equally effective, or it's imbalanced. One way is just better at reducing damage, or it's highly situational. The ways in which one are better are edge cases. So I personally do not like systems that use this sort of contrast between the two things because it's very hard to balance, it's hard to make feel distinct, and it all comes down to how can I not take damage. Again, it is different when there is an action-driven mechanic in there because you are actually playing differently. But if it's purely stat-driven, it just comes down to what is the better way to avoid damage. So the Souls games, which is the action stuff that I'm talking about, kind of takes a different approach where you have a slow state that results in what players call fat rolling. This is kind of... It's not explicitly the penalty state, but it's not a state that you usually want to get into because it will. It is very deleterious to playing the game. So it's load based. It's not by armor type. Based on your statistics, you can wear and carry heavier armor. But heavier armor does weigh more, so the better armor requires better stats to actually make a good use of. And arguably in Souls and Elden Ring, heavier armor isn't that good. Usually, again, there are exceptions, but overall it's not that great. It's certainly not worth getting into a slow state. So the result is that you avoid a heavy load at all costs, usually just by wearing lighter armor. If that's by design, that's totally fine, but a lot of players don't necessarily understand that, and so they undertake a heavy load, and it can be rough. And really, other than your real armor rating, poise is ultimately more important. So this is an example. I believe this video was called Why You Don't Fat Roll. Actually, was that very loud? I don't know what the volume on that was. Was that really loud before I play the whole thing? Very loud? All right. I'm going to... Ooh, let's see if I can adjust the... I'm going to see if I can adjust the volume down on that. I don't know if I can adjust the volume down. Actually, I can turn the volume off. There we go. Oh, I can just do this. Okay. So there's a character here with a heavy load who cannot really get away from this attacker. The fact that he's wearing heavy armor ultimately is not important because the fat rolling is getting him killed. Fat rolling is very not good. And ultimately, again, if you can just not get hit. So I'm sure most of you, if you are familiar with Elden Ring, saw this very early on, but this player, Sunhi Legend, has some incredible videos. Yeah, you don't need armor. It's just that easy, folks. You get the idea. Whoops. So I do also want to talk about what is kind of armor number soup. These are systems that are indirect. you can't really determine what the value of your armor is because it's abstracted through either a single number or a number plus a number of invisible modifiers. Lots of games do this. I don't like it at all. I'm just going to say right away, I don't like it. So, what is armor number soup? It uses numbers as an abstraction of something else. WoW, Skyrim, Elden Ring, Cyberpunk 2077, they abstract total values into something else. And sometimes that something else can be intuitive, kind of. Sometimes it's not super important. You just need to know that the number is higher. But the player usually doesn't know what's actually going on. Theory crafting might reveal it. The game usually does not do it. So it kind of winds up being that you have to look up Reddit threads or other things, and people will tell you kind of how it works, but you really have to do a lot of digging to figure that stuff out. So Elden Ring will show you a damage negation value, and that is a value that is helpful. They say, hey, this is abstracting into something else, and this is hopefully more valuable to you to figure out what's going on. I don't like these systems. I've already said that. But displaying the total effect is much better than nothing. Having the abstraction, the damage negation value, is much better than just having a number that you can't work out. The reason I don't like this, because as a player, if you can't be meaningfully informed, you can't make a meaningful decision. Decision choice? Great typing. Anyway, you can't make a meaningful choice or a decision about what armor to wear because unless it really comes down to is the number better. But usually armor has many other statistics and many other modifications and things that you can do. But if you don't really understand the significance of that margin, the difference between the old suit of armor and the new suit of armor, it's very hard to figure out what you're supposed to do. So here's something slightly embarrassing, which is my character in Cyberpunk. So this character is 50th level, which is crazy. This character, this is a meathead. I only have spec'd into I've only spec'd into basically assault and like some other stuff. No crafting, like nothing. So I just pick up gear and I do pure upgrades. And I will put armadillo mods on, but that's it because she has like virtually nothing other than combat skills. But take a little gander at. So I don't know what, or when I was playing this at the time, I didn't know what's good armor. What is a good number? I guess I have a chance to mod all of these slots, so I'm going to put armadillo in each mod slot because it makes my armor better. But here's the thing, my armor is 1400. That sucks. So like all of those slots, which are sort of abstractly seem like a good thing would be to put armadillo mods in, they're not really that good because this armor value is really very bad. I could have put all sorts of other mods into those slots, but there's no way to really know what that does unless you go and read a big thread or a wiki about it, which is very unfortunate. So if you don't actually know how that works, it's very rough. And yeah, you can spec into crafting and you can make better armadillo mods. You can make better armor. But again, the thing is, if you don't understand the margin of superiority of doing that, why would you? You don't know what the value is. You just know that there's a higher number. As opposed to a mod, for example, that might increase your reload speed by 8%. That's very easy to understand. Even if it's really marginal, if a reload takes a second, you're looking at a very, like a fraction of a second increase, but you can figure that out. Whereas with armadillo or any of these armor values, it's very, very difficult to figure out what's going on. So, DT and DR in Fallout 1 and 2. I personally really like systems like this. I think when I announced this talk, someone on Twitter said, this is probably going to be about how much Josh likes DT and DR, and it's true. Let me tell you exactly why. Mostly because it's pretty straightforward, and it's not that hard to tune. Players can figure it out pretty easily. I've used versions of these two things in most games that I've worked on. So, DT and DR. Damage threshold. DT is damage threshold. That's a flat value that's subtracted directly from damage. DR is damage reduction. That's a percentage subtracted from damage. You can do these in different orders. I can't remember the order in Fallout 1 and 2. I think maybe it was DR then DT. One way that has a bigger effect. But the effective damage threshold is small damage values get reduced by a lot. So if you get hit by a bunch of little teeny things, that DT takes a big chunk out of the overall value because each instance of damage is low. If you have 7 DT and each bullet does 10 damage, then it's only 3 damage per bullet. If you get shot by a rifle for 80 damage and it only takes 7 off, then it didn't really do much at all. So small damage values are massively reduced. High damage values are less impacted. The effect of damage reduction is that all damage values are equally affected because it's a percentage reduction. But what that means is that the higher the damage done, the more effective that DR is because it's a percentage operator. If you have 20% damage reduction and you get hit for 10 points of damage, DR is going to take off 2 points of damage. If you get hit for 100 points of damage, it's going to take off 20. So it universally applies to everything, but it is a percentage, so it is more effective the more damage is done. And it is less effective against smaller damage values. They are used together to produce a wide spectrum of mathematical effects, let's say. So damage reduction in Fallout 3. Damage reduction was the only form of damage mitigation in Fallout 3. Someone's going to tell me I'm wrong, but for the most part, I'm almost positive that was it. It was just damage reduction. Armor, medics, and everything else granted damage reduction. Growing percentage reduction and growing hit point totals meant that damage has to bloat to compensate. You will run out of runway. There are only 100 points in 100%, right? I mean, you can subdivide it, but essentially it's just going to keep going up and keep going up, which means that for damage to get through that percentage reduction, which keeps inflating, you have to do more and more damage. And if the player and the enemies are also getting more hit points, you have to bloat it even more to actually provide a threat to the characters as their armor goes up. By the way, the reason why I use this terminology of running out of runway is as you keep leveling up and you keep increasing armor values and you add expansions and you add more and more things, you're going to run out of room to grow. The system can only grow so much because you're playing with percentages. Yes, it was capped at 85, but that's the thing. Once you're capped at 85, the value of any reductive effects over that are gone, basically. They just don't do anything. So damage threshold in Fallout New Vegas. So in Fallout New Vegas, we pretty much just used DT. There were a couple of examples of DR. Heavier armor slowed movement down, not that meaningfully, a little bit, and it weighed more, which, like in the stock game, it didn't mean that much because your carry weights were quite high. A small number of meds and other bonuses granted relatively small amounts of damage reduction. Rebreather, yes. I think medics still did. A few things granted damage reduction. It worked very well at lower levels because it normalizes damage amounts. So at low levels, when the range of damage is pretty small, pretty effective, pretty clear effect on how things work. And it promoted weapon switching in the symmetrical system because enemy armor is like player armor. The example I usually give for this is that around the time that you get the hunting rifle and the SMG, you're fighting raiders in okay armor and you're fighting nightkin in no armor who have a ton of hit points. And weapons like the SMGs with hollow point ammo are very, very good against the nightkin and not very good against raiders, usually who are at range. And the rifle is extremely good against raiders and it's not very good against the nightkin at all. So the system works pretty well at low to mid levels. And you never run out of runway. DT can always keep going up. Now, you don't want it to go up forever, really, but you can keep scaling it. It can keep going up and up and up and up, and DT can just keep going. There is a minimum damage value for this stuff, so armor will only ever protect you. I think it's 80%, so 20% of damage will get through. The player is never completely invulnerable to damage, which means that DT can keep going up and low-level enemies can still do something to the player, even if it's not that much. Uh, this works less well as damage values get very high. If you just use a DT system, you can't effectively protect against big hits. For example, anti-material rifles, missiles, mini nukes. Because the DT values are tuned around guns, when something explodes and it does 100 points of damage or 200 or 300 points of damage, then it doesn't really do very much. So it feels like not good. So let me talk about what I did in my mod. So I made a mod called J Sawyer for Fallout New Vegas, and I added damage reduction to all armors in the game. So I added the percentage damage reduction to all armors that existed. I kept them pretty darn low because I didn't want them to run away and get super crazy. The DR values had very limited vertical progression. I don't think I tuned them very well, but in any case, they didn't get super high. So it's not like incredibly important. In fact, I think in retrospect, I probably could have just pegged light, medium, and heavy armor at fixed values, and it would have been probably pretty good. Because it's just a percentage. In the late game, heavier armors could soak up bigger hits through DR, so missiles, mini nukes, and such were more survivable. The DR does a lot of heavy lifting, the heavier the damage gets. There wasn't really wide enough testing to be conclusive, but in my opinion, it felt better. I have heard anecdotal commentary from people that it felt better. I do believe that in the end, this was a pretty good way to go. I did want to take a moment to... Well, that says DT behind the image there. Talk about Kingdom Come Deliverance, which has a pretty interesting armor system that is more or less DT based. I didn't dissect all of the mechanics of this, but I did want to mention it because I cut that off. It has slash, so every suit of armor, or every piece of armor, it's a very piecemealy system, stab, slash, and blunt defense. It has a visibility stat, which affects sneaking. It has a conspicuousness stat, which is like how you stand out socially. Noise, which affects sneaking around. Charisma, which is how people react to you. And durability. These were all pretty important stats within the game. It has multiple layers of armor in the system, and strength limits the maximums. The numbers used were fairly simple and straightforward. You could layer them. It felt very simulative, like most things in Kingdom Come Deliverance, because it's very historical and trying to be very accurate and simulative. And I don't know. I just wanted to bring it up because it's another game that uses a fairly realistic armor system in terms of how armor is put on and layered that uses stats in an interesting way. That's also fairly straightforward. The damage values, the reduction values are pretty clear. So, damage reduction, this is my error. I called it damage reduction, but there is it's really a threshold system in Pillars of Eternity. So it's largely similar to Fallout New Vegas, but it's more confusing / worse. By the way, the reason why it's called damage reduction is it's my responsibility, but somebody basically convinced me that people wouldn't understand threshold, so I called it reduction. But then people who were really familiar with the games were like confused. Anyway, it's my fault. It's my responsibility. But it's really a threshold system. It's not a reduction system. It's largely similar to Fallout New Vegas, but it's more confusing and worse. Many different damage types. So there's slash, pierce, crush, and then corrode, freeze, burn, shock, and raw. So there's 8 damage types, one of which cannot be protected. Armor doesn't protect against. Heavier armor means longer recovery between attacks. This worked pretty well for the most part. Like it kind of said like, hey, if you don't want everyone in heavy armor, because if you're not really a tank and you're not in the line of fire, you want to have a high turnaround on your actions. So you don't want high recovery. The damage values did blow up more because more attacks did big damage relative to DT. From my perspective, it didn't really seem like people made well-informed decisions, from my perspective, about armor or attacks. And it was a symmetrical system. The way DT worked for you is the way that DT worked for enemies. But people, like the choices they made and how they attacked into enemies, that was usually where it seemed like people were not really making. They would get either frustrated or confused because they would use things that weren't that effective, or they would switch because they thought it would be more effective and it wasn't because the system is a little hard to parse. So another thing that was confusing is pulsing damage over time. It used 25% of the damage threshold value to resist it, which is not really intuitive, but because DT tended to be fairly high values for those procs and those dots, which were usually marginal, if it was going against the full DT value, it just didn't do anything at all, or it was like minimal damage. So we had to make a special case, and that was not clear. And it was difficult to understand how impactful DT was against any given attack. So yeah, I don't think it was great. A lot of people did like it. People that liked the game liked it, but some people just were like, I don't really know how it works. I just kind of. So, Pillars of Eternity DRM practice. You have an enemy with 16 burn DT and 20 shock DT. The player can attack with a fireball that does 25 to 35 burn, or they can attack with Crackling Bolt, and that does 30 to 50 shock. Shock DT is higher, so therefore I should use Fireball. Right? No, because the average damage will be lower, because 30 minus 16 is 14, and 40 minus 20 is 20. So different defenses also matter. So if the enemy has 25 corrode DT, and 50 reflex, and 30 fortitude, and Noxious Burst does 30 to 42 corrode damage, what are you supposed to do? What attack should you use? It's not very clear. And then, for example, these big hits, the Master Below, the breath attack does 180 corrode damage. So it doesn't really matter what your corrode DT is, because the damage is so high that it will just completely obliterate that stuff. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of things to think through and figure out, especially when you're doing real-time with pause and you have 5 or 6 characters, or possibly 7 if you have a ranger with an animal companion. So it gets a little nuts. So I'm thinking, how can I fix the Pillars of Eternity DR system? Well, so I will tell you the things that I thought were wrong in Pillars armor systems. Players can't quickly make informed decisions about attack efficacy versus DT. How effective will this be against the DT that I'm looking at? High DT values still can't account for massive damage. For example, the Master Below. So my thinking was, adding damage reduction solves 2, but it doesn't solve 1, meaning if I add damage reduction, then the big hits can be absorbed, but players still won't be able to make informed decisions about what they should be using. So my solution was, let's make a completely different system for armor mitigating damage. And I went way back into the sands of time and looked at a system that says quality, by the way, to a game called Darklands that came out in 1992. So Darklands was a 1992 historical fantasy role-playing game. It used historical armor and weapons. And weapons and attacks would fail to penetrate, match, or fully penetrate armor based on type, kinda, sorta, more or less. So for example, longsword penetrates up to Cuerbolí, it matches scale, and it cannot penetrate brigandine. The military hammer penetrates up to chainmail, and it matches plate armor, which is the highest armor in the game. So it's a matching system. Great. And there is a percentage reduction based on non-penetrating, matching, and penetrating. Wow, great, awesome. So no problem. Every enemy's armor is expressed in type terms, so even monsters will say they have scale or leather or plate or whatever, so it's clear and valid throughout the entire game. Right? Sure. So, the system that I made was penetration and armor rating in Deadfire. It's not exactly the same, and you'll see why. So, all attacks that do damage have a penetration score. Attacks that don't do damage don't have penetration because it doesn't matter. Just a second, sorry. All creatures have armor ratings for every damage type. If the penetration of your weapon is greater than or equal to double the armor rating, you will overpenetrate. You will do 130% damage. If penetration is equal to armor rating, but below 2x, then that penetrates. It just does the listed damage. And if penetration is below armor rating, no pen. You suffer minus 25% damage per point down to negative 75% maximum. So it's pretty straightforward and universally applies. Magic, attack modes, and other things can both affect penetration and armor rating. And I should say that this applies to everything. So it doesn't matter if it's a dot, if it's a dragon breath, if it's whatever. All damage values are affected by the penetration and armor systems. There are benefits to this. So there's a fixed range of damage output. 100% is very typical. So if you're hitting the range that you need, which is 100% up to just below 200%, then you're going to do the listed damage. Whatever the damage is, you're going to do it. 130 can happen if overpen is happening, and 25% if you're like way below. And that's it. That's the whole range of damage output, and it's pretty clear. Beating a penetration deficit feels very significant because if you are way below and you inch your way up, each point is going to add 25% until you hit penetration value. Or the armor rating, sorry. Overpenetration is rare, but it is rewarded. Players love to min-max, so if you can actually get your pen double the target's armor, then great. You could do 30% more damage, which is not going to end the world, but it's nice. It's a nice little benefit there. And penetration and armor rating can scale infinitely. They're always relative values. So if the penetration is 85 and the armor rating is 87, then that works just the same as if it's 3 and 5, respectively. Very straightforward. And small and huge damage values are affected equally. So an attack can do 20 to 30 damage with 10 penetration, or 100 to 150 damage with 6 penetration. You can have attacks that do a lot of damage that have low pen. You can have attacks that do very little damage and have high pen. All sorts of stuff. They're completely decoupled systemically. But there are problems. It's much less intuitive than either DT or DR. You can explain to someone DT, it's just subtracted straight, and people, even if they aren't doing the math, they get it. They're like, oh, okay, great. Like, I have 10 DT and I get hit for 30 damage, then I take 20 damage. Gotcha. Awesome. Great. Very straightforward. DR, again, people don't do percentage operations in their head, but if you tell them that you have 25% DR, okay, so a quarter of all damage is coming off. It's very, very easy to understand what's going on. If players don't get it, if they don't understand the penetration and armor system, they usually suffer worse than if they don't understand DT, because the penetration and armor rating system is much more punitive. It's usually more punitive than the DT and DR systems. Pumping damage is very easy to understand. Pumping penetration and damage is a lot harder to understand, even though it's just one more thing. But it's one more thing on every single character. And many players were really turned off by the system. They did not like it. Were they a vocal minority? Probably. Informally, I took polls from my very biased Twitter followers, and people seemed to like the system more. But the people who did not like it They really did not like it at all. Those who liked it usually loved it. Those who did not like it usually hated it, and often hated the combat. So, all that being said, here are some thoughts for the future. Effectiveness, distinctiveness in gameplay, and scalability across the game while maintaining different aesthetic styles, those are still the goals. Next time I work on an armor system, I will probably try for a more straightforward combination of damage threshold and damage reduction, because again, I do feel like ultimately that covers most cases pretty well. It's hard to make a system that does all things in terms of goals, so you do have to prioritize. And I do believe ultimately that Deadfire's system worked better mechanically, but was much harder to teach to people. Maybe that is a problem simply of teaching people, but there's a lot of stuff to teach people in these games, so that's not an insignificant thing. Sometimes you want to make something easy to understand. An alternate idea that I have had recently, which is a much more simplified version of this, is penetration and armor categories that are very broad and simple. They're not numerical, so it's low, medium, or high penetration and armor, and quality levels for simple and clear tactical distinctions. So for example, if you basically think of it kind of like you know how in D&D, I don't even know if 5th Ed uses this anymore, but basically if you don't, a plus value is required to sort of like get through damage reduction. It would be like if you don't match the quality level, then it's not good, like you suffer a big deficit. And then if you don't match the armor rating with the penetration category, then you also suffer. So you want something that's high enough quality versus the armor and the right penetration category to get through it. That could be a way to do it that is very simple. It's very clean and simple. And then the vertical progression would be about quality, and then things that are completely separate and orthogonal to damage reduction. They're secondary effects, stat bonuses, whatever. But that is another way that I could see that working. Do not underestimate the importance of clarity. Obviously, I complained a lot about abstract systems in here. If the system doesn't click with the player, they're simply not going to be able to play with it, or they will try to, and they will get frustrated, and that's not good. Sometimes frustration is good, but not if it's unintentional. If you just want people to respond to number goes up, that is the extent to which they will engage it. So if the only thing you want is for a player to look at what number is higher than another number, and you sacrifice everything else to that, then everything else will be ignored. And all they will look at is the number going up. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to the players who have given me feedback for everything I've done wrong and occasionally right over time. Thank you to Julia for pushing me to get this talk done. Like I said, I gave it at D-Stars. I did want to credit the two artists because I just looked online for this stuff. Daniel did that art back for the original launch of New Vegas, and Wes Burt, I didn't list him here, but Wes Burt was the artist who actually concepted the NCR Ranger. And yeah, you can follow me on these places or email me. And that's about it. We're going to do a Q&A now. I don't know if we want to moderate this or if Sam wants to, I don't know. Hold on. Is everyone, I'm going to go away from the screen in 5 seconds. So look here and get my contact stuff. And then I'm going to go to, thank you, Sam. Now I'm going to go to wide view. Can I go to wide view? Hold on. All right, here we go. And then I'm going to also move this over here so I can look at the camera a little more easily. Okay, I'm going to answer these as I get them. By the way, I should say if I don't get to your stuff, go to my Tumblr and ask there, and I can probably answer it there. Kalen B. Question on the grokkability of an armor system. What are your thoughts on exposing the math during the targeting and combat phase? For example, XCOM will give you a percentage chance on the target and damage quantity possibility. My personal bias toward the number go up good feeling is that teasing how to make it go further is best accomplished as cluing through the combat UX stat screen, but I don't have a lot of examples to point through. This is actually something that we struggled with on Deadfire because we have grazes, which I didn't even get into, but we have hits and grazes and crits, and we have underpen and penetration and overpen, and that's for every character and every enemy. So how do we actually condense that down into something that is um, easy to communicate on a tooltip? Again, this comes down to, yeah, ultimately you can explain it in a glossary or like a rule book somewhere. But in the moment playing, it's very difficult for people to parse all of that stuff. So I think that you should really strive to get things as simple as clear as possible without requiring people to slow way down, even if the game is turn-based. And I should say, there's also challenges in a real-time with pause game that don't exist in a turn-based game. Or rather, the pressures are different. A turn-based game, even with a turn-based game, I do think you have to be careful to have a system that where you can adequately communicate everything the player reasonably needs to know about their chances of success and what the results of that success are going to look like. So I don't know if I actually answered your question, but I tried. But I think ultimately it comes down to, I think you have to be careful about how much information you load into the UI. I'm just as guilty as any other designer of overloading the player's senses with stats and rules and things. So, and I watch people play the game and I see them get frustrated, and that's my fault. So there you go. Um, do 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 do. Harrigan or Hurrigan. Could be Harrigan or Hurrigan. Thanks for the talk, Josh. Could you speak to the unique issues that change the considerations for tabletop games? For example, unlikely that armor having separate elemental DTs works well for players at the table. That is a very good point. So this is actually something in the Pillars tabletop game that I ran into where I did have separate values for slash, pierce, crush, and all the elemental things, and it was really slow. And I did retain elemental distinctions, but I dropped all the physical distinctions, primarily because having to constantly subdivide all of the physical damage types, which represent the majority of damage done, was exhausting and not interesting, and not usually thematically that interesting, whereas elemental distinctions in a fantasy game usually feel more appropriate. They're a little less frequent. So if you have fire elementals or blights in the case of pillars, and their armor or they're immune or their armor is very high against burn, that feels a little like, okay, that makes sense. It's less. A lot of people have said that the resistances for physical stuff feels very arbitrary in pillars, which I don't necessarily disagree with. Um, Also, though, I changed the entire armor system for the tabletop game because constantly subtracting values becomes kind of tiresome in a tabletop game, especially if you have a bunch of separate DTs, even for just elemental stuff. So in tabletop, and by the way, I should say there are systems, not super popular necessarily, but like Harnmaster, that have very in-depth armor systems that expect you to do that tracking. I mean, you can design things however you want, but you need to understand that players are going to only have so much tolerance for how fiddly that stuff gets. And if it's a tiny audience and that's all you care about, and if your friends all like it and you just want to play with your friends, that's great. But if you want to reach what would be considered sort of mainstream tabletop gaming, the cognitive load can't be super high, or you're going to exclude a lot of players from dealing with it. Rambo. Why did the team ultimately decide to almost completely drop DR for Fallout New Vegas instead of going for the mix system in J Sawyer? And I can't speak for Bethesda on why they used the pure DR system. But I think initially I just wanted to keep it relatively simple. I also knew from my experiences in playing Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 that scaling DR gets really you run out of runway. So I wanted to minimize the effect of DR in the system, which meant we'll just take all the sources of it out. So you have a few things that can do that and give you DR, but not many. And I think it was one of those cases where I overcorrected and really, I think if I had had more time because it was a pretty short development cycle, I would have experimented more with DT and DR, but I had more confidence that DT and from playing the game, it felt like especially at lower levels, DT feels very good to play with both as a player or both on the player side and on the enemy side. I can make weapon choices based off of enemy DT. I can make armor choices based off of the trade-off I want between speed and protection. So that's why I just went with DT. And I think if I had more time, I would have just come around to. Also, there were display issues. We had to go for the crossfading, which is not ideal, but we do that for DAM and DPS as well. But yeah, that's pretty much it. House to Fly, what are some current games where you feel the armor system is well done and intuitive? For example, you don't know what the heck is going on in Elden Ring. Um, you know, like I said, I think Kingdom Come Deliverance is fairly clear. Um, my bias is again, I'm going to say that I think that Pillars One, it's at the very least, it's pretty clear what's going on. I don't know how interesting of a system it is to necessarily play with, but it's pretty clear what your armor does. You can make pretty informed decisions about what armor you want to use. I do think that systems that use pure DR and DT or one or the other, I think they're just easy to understand, more or less. And so I'm always going to sort of push more towards systems that do that. C cubed 17. Fallout 2 had an AC system as well as DR and DT. Do you think those systems worked well together, or did they clash? Again, I don't like it. I think they could have just ditched AC entirely. I don't really think it's super important. I think again that goes back to that idea of multiple ways of damage mitigation, and they're kind of linked on the same gear. I don't think it necessarily felt super compelling. I think you could have cut AC out and just had sort of static values. Like Cyberpunk Red tabletop, they pretty much use fixed values for hitting targets of a certain size at a certain range for different weapon types, and it's like totally fine. And armor is ablative, or well, it is ablative. It subtracts damage and it also gets worse, and it works pretty well. And the AC and the avoidance component doesn't really, it's just not doesn't feel that important. Mr. Timothy Cuddles, for a pillar style fantasy game, would it be good to use the DRDT system from the FNV J Sawyer mod with the limited damage types? For example, a physical or magical damage split. Seems really easy to understand while keeping magic different to a sword. I think something like that could work. Again, I do think that you kind of run into some situations where it feels in a fantasy setting like it feels very appropriate for certain enemies to not take damage from certain types. Now, maybe that's not, or very much less damage from certain types. Maybe that doesn't need to be represented in the armor system. Maybe that can be a keyword typing like burn, and you just say, yes, these enemies don't take any damage from burn. Um, I think you could do that, and it would certainly make the armor system a lot easier to parse, much easier to understand. I think something like that could work well. Yeah, I don't think it's a bad idea. InkQuest. Many players place a lot of importance and priority of appearance when it comes to armor. When designing the numbers and gameplay side of an armor suit, is this taken into consideration? The way that I look at putting anything into the game is give me a reason to use this. And that reason, I want it to be aesthetically appealing. But the thing is, if something is aesthetically appealing and mechanically unappealing, that's not good. It's one of the reasons why I push for things that might not necessarily be quote unquote realistic, at least not in a purely in the way that we simulate things. So, for example, why do quarterstaves, excuse me, why do quarterstaves in pillars do as much damage as a greatsword? Because I want people to use them. Why does every weapon of a certain size and handedness in pillars do the same damage as every other weapon of that size? Because I want people to use it. Why do they all have special abilities? Because I want people to use them. And when it comes to suits of armor or clothing or things like that, If people want the aesthetics of them, then I want there to be a reason to use them. Now, I do think that transmogrification is sort of separate. Like, it's important, don't get me wrong, but if I design a suit of armor, fundamentally, I want there to be some value to that. So I don't really like the idea of padded is bad armor, or like this type of armor is just bad. It's one of my biggest beefs with most of the. I ranted on this about this on Twitter, which is um, Dungeons and Dragons systemically usually has lots of bad armor and bad weapons. I don't mean like individual ones, I mean they're types. Medium armor is usually just bad. Many weapons are just bad. And in the long run, it kind of evens out with all the bonuses and everything like that. But it means that players have no reason to use those types of weapons or armor because they're mechanically disadvantageous. So as a designer, I always want to give players a reason to use something if they like the aesthetics of it. Hey Goonies. So a horizontal armor system. Yeah, I think you can have a purely horizontal armor system. So this would be armor where there's no vertical progression. You don't get armor that gets better over time. You have different suits of armor that are just distinctive in how they play. And I think that's also totally valid and cool and good. There are some the strenuous arguers that vertical progression is just bad. I don't really agree with that. I think that I understand that some players don't like vertical progression, but I understand that a lot of players do like vertical progression. I think it would be totally valid and to have games where the weapons and armor are distinguished sort of through more fundamental gameplay differences, and they don't get better. They're just different tools. They're just different tools that you use for different situations. Skullgun, I'll answer a couple more questions. Again, you can go to my Tumblr and ask more questions if I don't get to everything. And this, yes, this will be, there will be a VOD of this, and I will upload it to YouTube. So Skullgun, do penetration-based systems allow for any player variety, or do they necessarily funnel into one optimal build? I think there's quite a bit of variety. One thing that has come up repeatedly with, so there is a fundamental thing that I've noticed with some players about character concept and iconic weapons or iconic armor. It's more around weapons than armor, and the necessity tactically to switch attacks or weapons. So this will be like I am Mr. Katana Man and I only use katanas, but you have put me up against a guy that is almost invulnerable to slashing and piercing, and you are forcing me to use a crushing weapon, and I hate Obsidian Entertainment. So I think you kind of have to be either on board or not on board with the idea that players have to switch weapons, or at the very least switch targets in a target-rich environment, if their weapon is not effective against the enemy. Now, the way that I balanced weapons in Deadfire typically was the higher the penetration of the weapon, the lower damage it did relative to the weapons that had lower penetration. So you used lower penetration weapons against creatures with worse armor, and then once you got to the really gnarly armor lords, you really had to lean heavily into high penetration stuff. Um, Usually characters would have to carry backups or switch, or they would have to have weapons that had best of type. Um, I don't think in Deadfire it usually funneled characters towards optimal build. Even something like people will kind of sometimes look at the ultimate. That's not normal gameplay, and there are a small number of optimal builds specifically for the ultimate, which is not how players normally play the game. I do believe that Deadfire allows for quite a lot of build variety on anything below the ultimate. So even on Path of the Damned, which is arguably not that hard really, especially in the late game, you can make lots of different characters with lots of different weapons. Yeah, that's my opinion on that. Okay, I'll answer two more questions. Sorry. Hollow Ray, this is a very good question. Do I find that medium armor tends to occupy an awkward space in armor systems? Not as good at heavy, too many penalties can player delight. Is it better to have medium as a neutral state with heavy light existing with penalties and bonuses instead? It's better for medium to be marginally better than light or heavy. which sounds weird. But so for example, and I think that we actually wound up doing this on Deadfire, where so if light armor has the best recovery times and the worst DT, or the worst armor ratings, and heavy has the worst recovery time and the best DT, you would expect that medium would be halfway between them, but it wasn't halfway between them, if I recall correctly. It was slightly better than halfway between them. It still was not as good as the extremes. So the extremes were still like, if you wanted, like, no, I want to be super fast or I want super protection, then those were better. But the trade-off between DT and recovery was not right in the middle. It was slightly better, if that makes sense. So I think that it's a very good question because people avoid medium armor in a lot of games for those reasons. But I think that if you can actually bump it a little bit, you can find a place where a person has the trade-offs. They're still not as good as the people on the extremes at those extremes, but they are more balanced, which sounds unintuitive, but I think that's the way to do it. Um, Warrior, I see your question. I'm not going to answer it because it gets real. Yeah, it's complicated math. I do understand that. There's a lot of stuff with damage multiplication that gets weird, and yeah, that's always a problem. All right, one more question. Sorry, I want to end on a Sunken Stone Ship. Do you feel like armors that proc abilities, Sanguine Plate, Shot and Faith boots, that are too valuable to the point where players just ignore the numbers? Is that a good or a bad thing? Um, I think at a certain point, I don't think it's bad. I do think that if the armor component of it becomes irrelevant, then that's not good. But I don't think it's bad if players pick their gear based off of secondary things, whether they're procs or equipped effects or things like that. I don't think that's necessarily bad. I do think if those abilities are super strong, then that is a problem. But I think that's less of a systemic issue and more like the individual instance. Like, whoa, this one suit of armor, or these two suits of armor, this one weapon, it's like a high rate, or the impact is just super high, and it kind of makes not just the armor irrelevant, but it makes all other options irrelevant. That's usually the space that I don't like to get into because then, like, technically there's a choice, but players are like, well, why would I equip anything other than this? Um, that's usually so. I know people don't like how I tune things sometimes, but the very very tall blades of grass do need to be cut because otherwise everything below it is just so far below it. So I try to avoid situations where you have a lot of really crazy stuff that needs to come down, but sometimes things get through, or sometimes people just play with things in a way that you never anticipated, and it produces this kind of weird effect. So yeah, I don't think it's bad for players to pick things for reasons other than strictly speaking the armor rating. In fact, I think that's what a lot of the high level theory crafting in play is about. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. Okay, thank you everybody. I really appreciate you coming to my talk. Again, this will be on Twitch as a VOD, and I will upload it to YouTube in the next week. Thank you so much for coming. Again, you can write to me at my Tumblr page. It's jesawyer.tumblr.com. And yeah, thank you very much, and I will talk to you later. Bye.